Scientists cracked open Armenian DNA expecting one story: conquest, mixing, replacement. What they found instead was so strange that a Cambridge professor published it in the world's leading genetics journal and then admitted out loud that he couldn't explain it. There is a stranger hiding in the Armenian genome. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody knows when they arrived. And they should not be there at all. Armenian DNA is one of the most studied genetic mysteries in the ancient world. And the deeper researchers dig, the more the mystery compounds. This is the story of a people whose blood refused to change for 8,000 years, whose ancestors may have given the world its most spoken language family, and whose genome contains an uninvited guest that science has no name for yet. To understand why, you first have to understand the land. The Armenian Highlands sit at an average elevation of nearly 1,800 meters above sea level, ringed by volcanic peaks, carved by deep river gorges, flanked by the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Araxes. This was not peripheral territory. Every trade route connecting the Mediterranean to Iran, the Black Sea to Mesopotamia passed around this plateau. Every empire wanted it. Persia took it. Alexander took it. Rome and Parthia fought over it for generations. Arabs, Seljuks, Mongols, and Ottomans all planted flags here across 3,000 years of recorded conquest. And yet when scientists analyzed the genomes of modern Armenians against 78 worldwide populations, they found something that defied every expectation. Armenians formed their own completely distinct genetic cluster, bounded by Europe, the Near East, and the Caucasus, touching all three, fully belonging to none. The genetic signals of significant population mixing essentially stopped after 1200 BCE, not gradually, not slowly, like a flat line on a monitor. 3,000 years of conquest, and the blood barely moved. I have spent a long time with this finding, and I still think it is one of the most disorienting results in modern population genetics. The reason starts 50,000 years ago, before any empire, before any alphabet, before the concept of Armenia existed in any language. The South Caucasus was home to a people geneticists now called the Caucasus hunter-gatherers. These were small communities adapted to high altitude and hard seasons, genetically distinct from any other hunter-gatherer population on Earth, isolated enough by those mountains and gorges to develop a biological signature that persisted across incomprehensible stretches of time. That signature never left. 50 to 70% of Armenian ancestry today descends directly from these Caucasus hunter-gatherers. They are the foundation that nothing in 3,000 years of empire managed to erode. Then around 10,000 years ago, the world changed. Agriculture was invented, and the Armenian Highlands were not at the edge of that revolution. They were at its center. In a cave near the village of Areni in southern Armenia, archaeologists found the world's oldest known winery, dating to approximately 4,100 BCE. Wine production 6,000 years ago, 1,000 years older than any comparable site on Earth. From the same cave complex came the world's oldest leather shoe. And from the human remains buried, there came ancient DNA that told an extraordinary story. The Neolithic farmers who operated that winery carried the genetic signatures of the first agricultural revolution, layered onto the Caucasus hunter-gatherer foundation that was already ancient when they arrived. Their Y chromosome lineages tell the same story. Haplogroup J2, at roughly 26% of Armenian men, a direct line to Neolithic farmers spreading out of the Fertile Crescent. Haplogroup G2A, around 12%, the same lineage carried by the Tyrolean Iceman, Otzi, who died 5,300 years ago in the Alps and whose DNA looks remarkably similar to ancient Armenians. These weren't migrants from elsewhere who happened to arrive. They were the founding population of the agricultural revolution, and their descendants never left. But then came the Bronze Age, and for 2,000 years the highlands opened. Between 3000 and 2000 BCE, steppe herders moved south through mountain passes. Anatolian and Levantine populations pushed in from the west and south. Trade networks carrying bronze tools and obsidian connected the highlands to Mesopotamia, the Aegean, and Iran. You can see it in the DNA precisely. Eastern hunter-gatherer steppe ancestry peaks at roughly 14% in Bronze Age Armenians around 2500 BCE. The highlands were buzzing with genetic exchange. And then, around 1200 BCE, that exchange stopped. The late Bronze Age collapse is one of the most catastrophic civilizational failures in human history. The Hittite Empire collapsed in under a generation. Ugarit, the great trading port of the Levant, was burned and never rebuilt. Egyptian records describe famine, plague, and the mysterious sea peoples devouring kingdoms whole, the interconnected Mediterranean world essentially disintegrated within decades. For Armenia, this catastrophe did something strange. Instead of erasing the population, it sealed it. The trade routes died, the mountain passes went quiet, and the genome locked into place. But how sealed, exactly? That question sat with me for a long time, and the answer, when I found it, required a comparison I was not expecting. For decades in population genetics, Sardinians were the gold standard, the benchmark. The population researchers pointed to when they needed an example of ancient genetic preservation untouched by later migrations. The reasoning was sound. Sardinia is an island. The Neolithic farmers who reached it around 6000 BCE brought their genetics and largely stayed. When Bronze Age steppe migration swept across continental Europe, Sardinia was buffered by open water. When later Roman, Germanic, and Arab movements reshaped the mainland, Sardinia absorbed relatively little. Geneticists use Sardinian DNA as a proxy for ancient European farmer ancestry in dozens of studies because it appeared to represent one of the purest surviving signals of that original Neolithic population. The 2024 whole genome study of Armenians recalibrated that picture with a single finding. Modern Sardinians receive between 38 and 44% of their ancestry from post-Bronze Age genetic inputs. Sources including Iranian-related, steppe, and North African ancestry that arrived after the period they were being used to represent. They changed, measurably, substantially, in ways that only became visible when the analytical tools improved. Armenians showed far less comparable post-Bronze Age input than Sardinia. The population genetics community had spent years treating the island as the most ancient mirror available. The 2024 data suggests the highland was more intact all along, except the door was not as closed as it looked. That is the part that kept me up. In November 2024, researchers from Trinity College, Dublin, the University of Cambridge, and the Institute of Molecular Biology in Yerevan published the first ever whole genome study of Armenians in the American Journal of Human Genetics. 34 complete genomes, the first genetic atlas of the Armenian Highlands ever drawn. And buried inside their data was something that shouldn't be there, a second genetic input, after the Bronze Age, after the door was supposed to have slammed shut. The signal pointed toward Neolithic Levantine farmers, a population type associated with the ancient Near East, arriving into the Armenian Highlands at some point after the early Bronze Age. Not before. Not during the Bronze Age mixing. After. The lead researcher, Professor Andrea Manica of the University of Cambridge, stated publicly that, and this is a direct quote, the questions of exactly where and when it came from, as well as what triggered such a widespread migration wave, remain unanswered and yet to be studied. A Cambridge professor found a stranger in Armenian DNA and cannot tell you who it is. Of all the findings I have come across in researching this story, this one stayed with me longest. This is not a minor footnote. This is a large-scale movement that swept across the Middle East, left its mark in one of the most genetically isolated populations on Earth, and left no trace in the historical record that has yet been matched to the signal. Someone arrived in the Armenian Highlands after the genetic door was supposed to be closed. They came, they left their mark, and then history apparently forgot to record them. But there is a second discovery from that same 2024 study that is even more extraordinary, and almost no one is talking about it. The same paper cataloged a brand new MEFV mutation unique to the Armenian population, one that had never been documented before, predicted to cause familial Mediterranean fever. That name might not mean much to you, but the numbers will. 1 in 5 healthy Armenians carries at least one copy of a mutation in the MEFV gene. 1 in 5. That is one of the highest carrier rates for any hereditary condition anywhere on Earth. And researchers at the National Human Genome Research Institute confirmed through mathematical modeling that this is not coincidence. It is natural selection. Here is what they found. The mutated MEFV gene encodes a protein called pyrin. Normally, the bacterium that causes the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, suppresses pyrin's function to disable the body's immune response. But the mutated version found at high frequency in Armenians prevents the plague bacterium from doing this. Just like sickle cell trait protects against malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, the FMF mutation appears to have protected Armenians against bubonic plague. Carriers survived plague epidemics at higher rates. Over centuries, natural selection amplified the mutation through a genetically isolated population. The mountains sealed the genome in, and then the sealed genome concentrated this variant with every generation, until 1 in 5 Armenians carried a gene that helped their ancestors survive ancient plagues, but now causes painful, life-threatening inflammation in those who inherit 2 copies. Isolation preserved the population. Isolation also left its own mark on their cells. What I find most sobering about this is that the same force that makes Armenian DNA so extraordinary, the isolation, the continuity, the sealed gene pool, is also the force that concentrated a mutation that causes suffering. Survival always costs something. In this case, the bill was written into the genome itself, and it is still being paid today by real people in real hospitals. That is not a metaphor. That is biology. But the most counterintuitive finding of all sits at the intersection of language and genetics. In February 2025, Iosif Lazaridis, David Reich, and their team at Harvard published a landmark study in Nature, analyzing 428 ancient individuals to trace the origins of the Indo-European language family. They identified a genetic population they called the Caucasus Lower Volga Cline. The southern anchor of this cline sits in Neolithic Armenia. The individuals within this cline carried approximately 50% of their ancestry from Neolithic populations in the Armenian Highlands. And those CLV Cline people went on to contribute 4/5 of the ancestry of the Yamnaya, the Bronze Age steppe herders, whose expansion into Europe is the most consequential migration event in European prehistory. 4/5. 3.5 billion people alive today speak a language in the Indo-European family: Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, English. According to the most comprehensive ancient DNA study of Indo-European origins ever published, the genetic roots of all of those language speakers run back, in part, through the Neolithic people of the Armenian Highlands. Now comes the twist. If Bronze Age steppe migrants brought the Armenian language to the Highlands, then you would expect Armenians today to carry significant steppe ancestry. They don't. At the Bronze Age peak around 2500 BCE, steppe-related Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry reached 14% in Armenian highland populations. By the Iron Age, it had dropped to 10. By the Urartian period, 7. Today, modern Armenians carry roughly 1 to 3% steppe ancestry. Essentially nothing. The population that supposedly introduced the Armenian language contributed genetics that have now almost entirely diluted away. The language survived. The chromosomes of the people who brought it nearly vanished. The Armenian language has been spoken continuously for over 3,000 years by a population that carries almost no genetic trace of its original speakers. Culture proved more durable than the DNA of the people who created it. This is the deepest mystery of Armenian genetics. Not the isolation, not the continuity, but the fact that something as fragile as a language, transmitted by mouths from parent to child, outlasted something as biological and persistent as human chromosomes. The Armenian alphabet, created by Mesrop Mashtats in 305 CE. The Armenian Apostolic Church, established in 301 CE, the first state church in human history. These cultural institutions, built on a highland plateau between competing empires, appear to have been stronger preservation mechanisms than the genetic signature of Bronze Age steppe herders. So what does it mean that a people can carry 8,000 years of genetic memory, give the world the population that would eventually spread the language family spoken by half of humanity, resist genetic replacement through Persia and Rome and the Mongols and 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, survive a genocide that erased their presence from half their historic homeland, and still carry, in the cells of diaspora communities in Los Angeles and Beirut and Paris, a genome that science can trace in an unbroken line back to farmers who pressed the world's first wine in a cave 6,000 years ago. It means, at minimum, that the story of human identity is not written only in empires and conquest. It is also written in mountain passes that stayed quiet, and church walls that held, and an alphabet carved into stone by a monk in 305 CE, and a mutation that kept a people alive through plagues that erased everyone around them. And there is one thing still buried in that Armenian genome that science has not yet explained: a population that arrived after the door was supposed to be closed. A large-scale migration that swept the Middle East and left its mark in Armenian DNA and then disappeared from the historical record entirely. Professor Manica said the questions remain unanswered and yet to be studied. That study is coming. When it does, it may not just explain Armenian DNA. It may rewrite what we think we know about the entire ancient Near East. If you stayed with this one all the way through, that means something to me. A like takes 2 seconds and genuinely changes how many people this reaches. So if the story moved you, that is the simplest thing you can do. If ancient DNA, lost civilizations, and the questions that official history never quite answered are the kind of thing you find yourself falling into at 2 in the morning, subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss the next one. Send this to anyone who has Armenian roots, or anyone who has ever looked at a modern population and wondered how much of the ancient world is still quietly living inside them. And if something in here surprised you, tell me in the comments. I try to read every single one. And on a subject this deep, the comments section is often where the best threads start. Thanks for being here.